In this video, I'm going to show you how to fire ceramics with no kiln. In this case, we're going to use just a campfire to harden the ceramic work to a low bisque temperature. So right now I've got some coals started in this little campfire, and I'm going to prepare a work area with a safe perimeter so that I can control the fire and I'm not worried about it getting out of hand. I take fire safety very seriously, and you should too. Anytime you're working with open flame, you need to have water source or other means of putting the fire out ready at hand. It's also really important to have a safe perimeter, so rake up any flammable debris and make sure the dirt and everything around it is wet so that it's not going to spread. Also check the weather, because you don't want to be doing this on a windy day or a day where heavy rain and thunderstorms are expected, because those kinds of changes in the weather could ruin the ceramics or cause the fire to be unsafe. So as long as you're being safe, you're just going to start this campfire to build up some coals, and I'm preheating some of the work and making sure that it's completely dry by placing it near the edge of the fire before we really get started. And I'm also using these shards of old flower pots that I'm going to use kind of like a makeshift kiln or a sagger, just a way to protect the work from the logs that I'm going to be adding on top. So I'm preheating everything. That's the name of the game. You can see here there's a dark line on that piece of ceramic flower pot, and that's indicating there's still some moisture in that upper portion. So I want to preheat everything and make sure that everything is bone dry. There's no water left in any of the work. Then I'm going to let that first campfire actually go out completely. So the coals are almost dead. They're still warm, but nothing is really hot or actively burning. And at that point, I can slowly start to stack the greenware. And so I'm just going to carefully stack this in such a way that the most fragile pieces are protected by other work around the outside. Our enemy here in pit firing is drastic changes in temperature. So once the work gets really hot, we don't want cold air seeping in and hitting it, because that will cause thermal shock, which could crack the work. Our other enemy, though, is the stress of adding wood on top of these forms, and just the jostling that could occur could also crack the work. So we want to stack things in a manner that are going to protect themselves from the weight of the wood on the top, as well as from drafts of cold air or rapid changes in temperature. It's worth taking your time at this stage and really being sure that everything is positioned just how you'd like it. It's also a good idea to take a photograph of how this work is arranged so that you know kind of where it is, even after you build a fire on top where you can't see it visually anymore. You have a reference to understand relatively where the work is in terms of the firing. So you can see here I'm using the shards of flower pot to kind of protect the pile of the greenware. And a lot of people in pit firing will do this with shards of old pots that they've made, or in some cases you'll see people even make saggers or closed containers intentionally made to protect the work from the kiln atmosphere. So if you're going to do a lot of pit firing, you might investigate making your own saggers, because you're going to have a higher success rate, less chance of breaking this work, the more it's protected. So now in this stage I'm going to build the kiln, in quotes, because we're building this kiln completely out of wood. So this is actually going to burn as the fire progresses. But the idea is that these larger logs are going to burn slowly, and they're going to kind of seal off this inner chamber from drafts of cold air. So it's useful to have big logs, or at least logs that have been split into quarters. So these are actually a little bit overkill, but you want some big, relatively large pieces of wood around the outside so that the walls of your kiln remain intact for several hours of firing. And so here I am digging out some old coals and some wood ash from the fire pit that I'm going to use to fill in the cracks and crevices in the walls. By filling in around the work, this is going to help support weight on top of it, and it's also going to kind of seal up those cold air drafts that I'm concerned about. So if you don't have a pile of coals handy, or old wood ash from a fireplace or something, you can use sand, you can use duff from the forest floor, just the leaves and kind of detritus that you can rake up off the forest floor, or pine needles, basically any sort of organic matter that will both insulate the work and provide some material on the inside. Sawdust might be another good example. Now, when you're placing the wood, you want to pay special attention to the corners because those are the most likely places to have gaps where cold air is going to enter. So I'm using some duff and some wood chips to kind of do a little extra backfilling around the cracks in the corners especially. And once I'm satisfied with that, I'll start placing some planks and some boards over the top to complete this box. Kiln loading is a bit like playing Tetris, and so it's worth taking the extra time to get a really solid stack. You can see here that none of this new material is catching on fire immediately, and that indicates that the coals I had were almost out. And that's what you want, because you don't really want to be putting greenware right over the top of hot red coals. So we're just using that first fire to preheat everything. And once I'm done building this container, we'll actually build a new fire on top of it to really start the firing process. Now, I'm probably going a little overboard in the amount of wood I'm using for this small amount of ceramic. So if you don't have a big pile of wood at your disposal, you could get away with less fuel than I'm using. I've even done this with just a few bundles of firewood from a gas station and maybe a bag of charcoal to supplement. The type of fuel is not very critical for this type of firing, and we just need something that will burn at a steady rate for several hours. Whatever fuel type you're using, just take the extra time to really seal in between each of the pieces so there's no drafts. Before I light the second fire, I'm going to take one last look around, and especially looking under the logs for any crevices that I've missed. And I can just go ahead and patch that up with excess material before I get started. As the fire on the top burns, it's going to draw up air from beneath. So that's why we got to really protect our work, especially in the lower half of the kiln, from cold air drafts. Okay, so now to start the second firing, I'm going to cut some more kindling. I just wanted to show you this technique really quick because a lot of people cut kindling in a very dangerous way. A hatchet's a dangerous tool, but if you use a stick to hold your piece of wood, then your other hand is nowhere near where the blade connects. So I always recommend to use an additional stick to hold the work in place as you chop it with the hatchet. Okay, now we're building the second fire, and I'm just going to use a little log cabin method to get a small fire going on top of the pile of wood. It doesn't really matter what style you use, it's just an easy way to get a good draft going. You don't want to use fuel to start the fire at this stage because you do have some hot coals down there underneath, so any kind of vapors or fumes could be a dangerous situation. It may be tempting at this stage to build a large fire that's going to encompass the whole pile of wood, but it's important to resist that temptation and just build a small fire because we want this to burn slowly for several hours rather than to all catch at once and potentially thermally shock the work. So just build a small fire and just maintain it enough to keep it burning without it getting too hot too quickly. This process takes about 12 hours on the first day of actively tending the fire. So I started the preheat fire around 11 in the morning, and I'm going to continue monitoring this one until the coals are cool, probably around 11 or 12 at night. So as that small fire burns down, you can continue to add fuel around the outside. Just don't let it get too out of hand. We want a slow burning fire, building up coals on top of the pile of work. I'm looking closely in here to see if any gaps are developing between the logs, but so far so good, I think. Nothing is really open all the way into the inner chamber yet. And you can see that this fire is a really smoky fire. That's because we're kind of starving it of oxygen, creating a reducing atmosphere, which is going to change the color of the clay. If we had a kiln, then this amount of fuel could allow us to reach really high temperatures or fire a larger amount of ceramic work. But since we don't have a kiln to kind of contain the heat from this fuel, we're going to have to use kind of an inefficient firing method like this. And so the smoke is just going to be part of this process. I'm looking carefully in here, and it looks like there is a gap developing between those logs, so I'm going to patch that up. I'll allow that fire to keep burning for several hours and just continue to check for gaps and plug those gaps as they develop with either more sticks or more duff and leaves. I'm also bringing over some other broken flower pots to preheat, and I'm going to use those to kind of contain the coals at the end of the night. So you can see that things are burning, turning into coals. It's still a relatively smoky fire. As things continue to burn down, I'm going to keep pushing the fuel towards the center gently because I don't want to jostle the pots that are in the center. But I do want to keep moving the fuel towards the center to condense it, to plug up those holes, and to keep that fire concentrated in the center. Now you can see the outer layer of wood has burned down significantly and there are more gaps. However, I've plugged up the holes to the center chamber by shoveling some of the coals back down into those crevices. So as the wood continues to burn, I just keep trying to shield that center chamber. Now I'm adding some of the flower pot shards in as well to kind of help block any drafts. So you can keep using leaves, but I don't really want to add a whole lot more wooden fuel because I'm in the phase of the firing where I'd like it to start winding down and not end up staying up all night to maintain this fire. So I'm trying not to add a whole lot of fuel, but still maintain a relatively reducing atmosphere, kind of choking off any oxygen that I can. As things are winding down, it's getting later, and I'm just maintaining the same coals, trying to pile them up on top of the center chamber. But I want this fire to be cool enough that I can safely go to bed. And so if it's not cool, you can shovel dirt over the fire to smother it and protect it from flaring up with any wind gusts overnight. I'm going to use these flower pots in a similar way. It's super important to be really safe when you go to bed because this amount of coals could create a large fire very quickly. Here we are the next morning. The coals are still hot, but you can see that most of the fuel has burned away. These larger flower pots on the outside were meant to contain the remaining coals when I went to bed. And you can see maybe down through this crevice the inner chamber where the actual work was located. And so that's still pretty warm to the touch. It's not uncommon for these kinds of firings to stay warm for even 2 or 3 days, especially if you buried it with dirt at the end of the evening. That's a really nice thing that actually works to your advantage because it contains the heat longer and it's less likely to invite cold air into the warm work. And that's why a lot of people will dig a pit when they're doing this style of firing because the dirt around the fire will insulate the work better than this open campfire method. But digging a pit takes some effort, and so this is a quick and easy way to do it when you don't have maybe the space or the time to dig a pit. So it's tempting to go ahead and pull everything out as soon as you can, but resist the temptation until you can handle the pots with your bare hands. That'll tell you that they're cool enough to not be affected by thermal shock. So here are a few of the pieces that were cool enough to pull out. We've got one bowl that survived just fine, has a nice dull ping, meaning that we reached a decent temperature to sinter the clay into a bisque state. These are my peeps for the electric kiln. Those seem to be all intact. And I have one bowl that blew out around the foot. And this is likely due to moisture that was still trapped in that thicker part of the clay because I was rush drying these things by putting them next to the fire. And I guess they just didn't have enough time to get all the water out. So that's pit firing. It's very versatile, it's accessible, doesn't take a lot of tools or equipment, and it's a great way to get a hands-on experience working with ceramics.